The realm of rail transport is indeed a fascinating one. It boasts one of the richest histories of any industry, even if it is relatively young as human endeavor goes. For nearly 200 years around the world, it has etched itself into the very fabric of our lives, and as much if not more so than the highways did later, the rails have shaped the world we live in today. But one of the reasons why that history and culture surrounding it is as rich as it is due to how each rail system operates. And around the world, rail systems are often completely different from each other. And it's really when you sample rail systems other than the ones you grew up with that you can gain a better perspective on how different systems work and how each system could possibly learn from another. I myself certainly experienced that on a recent trip I took to Scandinavia this summer, as the trains, buses, trams, and subways are quite a departure and indeed for the most part are a genuine step up from what I've been used to here in the US. It's little wonder to me that a lot of urban planning and transit aficionados here in the States tend to look wistfully across the ocean to Europe and borderline idolize them for how well it is put together and how polished their transit systems are. While this certainly does overlook a lot of the issues that these systems still have, it's not hard to compare systems in Europe to systems in the US and become frustrated that our transit agencies and politicians can be so blind that other places run their public transit in ways that are inherently better, and anyone who has ever taken a trip to Europe can get the gist of it pretty quickly. However, this is not to say that no American city has ever tried to emulate a European transit system, and a fine example of that was the attempt by SEPTA, the transit agency of my home city of Philadelphia, to convert its regional rail system, one of the most sprawling and effective ones in the country with incredible potential, to run along the lines of an S-Bahn system, one of the most famous methods of operation for a city's commuter rail system in the world, which has had proven examples and derivatives, particularly in places like Western and Central Europe. Despite having the infrastructure and the broad strokes to make such an operation happen since the 1980s, and even creating a route naming convention taken from German S-Bahn systems, it never truly crossed that finish line of success. But while I was away, I rode on a system that not only crossed that finish line of success, but it could be argued it's set where the success lies, and it's setting its sights on taking it to even greater heights in the future. And it's from this city that I think my home city could take a lot of inspiration from and truly reach its dream that it set out so long ago. So, let's take a trip across the Atlantic to see it for ourselves, shall we? Welcome to Copenhagen, the capital and largest city of the Kingdom of Denmark. Home to beautiful and historic canals and buildings, cyclists, more Lego stores than there are historic churches, and it's got a lot of both, cyclists, an amusement park that inspired Disneyland, cyclists, the best hot dogs I've ever had in my life, not even kidding, and of course, cyclists. Copenhagen is truly the heart of Danish culture, and has been so almost from its founding in 1167. Today, Copenhagen's urban core is home to nearly 1.4 million people, with 667,000 in the town of Copenhagen itself, and officially the metro area is home to 2.1 million, which means that the Copenhagen metro area is home to around 1/3 of the population of the entire country of Denmark. While it is indeed an old harbor town established in the Middle Ages just after what is commonly known as the Viking Age came to a close, Copenhagen's current form is more modern than many may at first think, and especially so in its suburbs and connected towns. While some of them, such as Køge, Farum, Frederikssunds, and Hillerød, started as historic villages and market towns, these only truly became part of the Copenhagen metro area in recent decades. And that was primarily spurred by a particular key factor: the building and expansion of Denmark's railways. The Danish railway system is certainly old, though not quite as old as some European systems, with the first line opening in 1847 between Copenhagen and Roskilde, a line that's still used today. Originally founded and operated by individual private ventures, as did many railway systems in Europe and the Americas, these lines would be consolidated throughout the 1800s and come under ownership of the Danish government when the private companies went insolvent, which would eventually lead to the system's current foundation when the two main railway companies that were formed in the consolidations, the Zeeland Railway Company, Zeeland being this island, which is where Copenhagen is, and the state railways of Jutland and Funen, were merged in 1885 to create Danske Statsbaner, the Danish State Railways, or DSB for short. After a time of incremental improvements, DSB would truly make big strides in modernization in the 1920s and 30s, taking much of its developments from those that were being pioneered in Germany around the same time, with trains such as the first generation of the Lundtog, or lightning trains, being perhaps the most famous examples of this, with these streamlined diesel multiple units being derived from the German flying hamburger trains of the early 1930s. Yes, that's what they were actually called. But while the Lundtog was perhaps the most famous example, with that name still being used for the intercity express trains on the Danish network to this day, the most enduring and influential development that the Danish took from German practices would come in the form of the trains that would serve the suburbs of the big city, since it would be in Germany where the development of the S-Bahn would come around. So, what is an S-Bahn, you may reasonably ask? An S-Bahn, the name being a shortening of the German word Schnellbahn, meaning rapid train, could be best described as a commuter or suburban rail system for a city that operates in a manner that's closer to that of a rapid transit system, like a subway, while running trains with a traditional mainline loading gauge, much bigger than subways did at the time. And as such, it could be described as a fusion of a commuter rail system and a rapid transit system. What this often entails, even going back to the very first S-Bahn system, which opened in Berlin in 1924, was that these trains would run on infrastructure that was as separated as possible from the rest of the mainline railway network, something that the Germans were beginning to do for their suburban rail systems as early as the 1880s. It was ultimately this infrastructure separation and the replacement of steam power with electrification that would bring the S-Bahn concept to a head and truly make a suburban commuter rail system that functioned like a rapid transit system. And true to form, DSB would take this German development and bring it home to Denmark, with the Copenhagen S-Tog beginning operations in 1934 on the first two sections from Hellerup to Klampenborg and Van Loos to Frederiksberg, making them the first electrified rail lines in Denmark. It was an incredible success, and more extensions were promptly planned. But then everything quickly changed when the Mustache Man attacked. World War II would see Germany literally take control of Denmark in less than a day, April 9th, 1940 to be exact, and led to 5 years of brutal occupation. While another small section of electrification was completed under previous plans in 1941 between Vølby and Van Loos, it was evident that the wartime conditions generally, and specifically the occupation, would prevent further expansion for the foreseeable future, particularly after 1943, when the Germans officially took power away from the Danish civilian authorities that they let run the country for a time and put Denmark under direct military control. Eventually, in May of 1945, Denmark was liberated by the Allies, and the Danish people and government could finally set to work planning and building out what the country would look like in the post-war years. This would include the build-out of the S-Tog system, which would start in earnest in 1949 and would continue in phases and stages over the course of decades, reaching its current extent of 170 kilometers, around 110 miles, of lines by 1989, with the lines of the system reaching out of Copenhagen to Køge to the southwest, Høje Tostrup to the west, northwest on 3 lines to Frederikssund, Farum, and Hillerød, and north to Klampenborg in a radial pattern reaching out from the suburbs. As well as a circumferential line around the city proper, with the main nexus points of the network being the beautiful Copenhagen Central Station to connect with regional and intercity trains, Nørreport for connections to Copenhagen's driverless metro, which started construction in the late 90s and early 2000s, along with several major connecting points along the Ring Line Route F, connecting the other S-Tog, regional, and metro lines. As for the trains themselves, like every proper S-Bahn system, the S-Tog has used electric multiple units for nearly 100 years at this point. And going from the original first generation units of the 1930s, which would look right at home alongside the likes of the Melbourne Tate and Swing Door trains, or the Pennsylvania Railroad MP54s and Reading Blue Liners, the current trains on the network, the fourth generation S-Tog trains, built by Linkhoffmann Busch, Alstom, and Siemens in the late 90s and early 2000s, are certainly one of the most unique looking trains of any system I've ever seen, with their rotund hexangular shape and really short coaches, which are bizarrely hung up in most cases on one axle per coach. This configuration makes the trains very good at handling tight curves, and the trains are operationally very flexible, with the 8 and 4 car sets able to couple up and split at different times of day easily, creating 12 and 16 car sets during peak hours. Inside, the body style provides very wide interiors for them, with plenty of seating, effectively making them 3+3 bench seats, something I've never seen before anywhere else on a train and I don't think is even physically possible in a lot of systems. It really goes to show how big the loading gauge on the lines here are. And that size also gives them a lot of standing room, and also a whole 1 or 2 cars of each set devoted to carrying passengers and their bicycles. You gotta remember, this is a city famous for cycling alongside the likes of Amsterdam. They also ride really well despite the single axle wheel sets, with the well-maintained track work certainly helping that cause along. I honestly can't recall ever feeling a single major bump in the track work the whole time I was there. And I was in the Copenhagen metro area for a week and a half while I was on this trip, not counting a weekend trip to Stockholm I took while I was there. Oops, spoilers. All told, I think I have 3 little gripes with these trains, and maybe 4 if you count the weird sensors for the sliding doors between cars where you almost always need to reach up to make the sensor work, but I think I got used to that pretty well, I think. The first one is that the air conditioning on most trains I rode on was borderline useless, pretty much requiring the opening of the hopper windows to get ventilation. I know that Denmark doesn't tend to suffer from brutal heat waves like a lot of other places do, but you can definitely feel that heat sometimes. The second is the wheel configuration seems to contribute to wheel slip issues in the rain, though I know that's a problem with most trains, but you can really feel it on these things, particularly since Denmark is a country where it tends to rain a fair bit. And then of course, there's the graffiti. I know this is a problem in a lot of places, especially in Europe, but the graffiti definitely kind of stuck out to me, especially on the non-refurbished trains, with refurbished ones generally avoiding the graffiti, thankfully. However, just to mildly annoy my Danish friend Nick, who I stayed with during this trip, here's some pictures of it. Now, to be completely fair to the Danes, they are far from the worst in that regard. There are definitely countries that are way worse with train vandalism.
Hello there.
And DSB is actively fighting it, but it was still kind of funny to me. Anyway, let's get to how the network functions. The S-Tog network is already off to a great start, since DSB gave the network 3 core infrastructural perks that makes any city's rail transit system great. Electrification, grade separation from roads, streets, and other rail lines, and also operational separation from the rest of the national network, so as to avoid conflicts with other passenger and freight trains. In fact, the S-Tog runs on a completely different electrification system than the entire rest of the Danish network. While the S-Tog and the national network are electrified with overhead catenary, the correct form of electrification, the S-Tog runs on an older system running at 1600 volts DC, whereas the national network was electrified with a 25,000 volt AC system, similar to the one in France, and a voltage that has since become a mainline global standard. Even we used it in the US for the Northeast Corridor North End electrification to Boston. This effectively seals off S-Tog trains from the rest of the network, greatly simplifying things and enabling high frequencies to be achieved. Not every S-Bahn system around the world does that, but the best ones like Copenhagen do. And speaking of frequencies, let's get into that, because they are amazing. To give some context, I mentioned in my video talking about Philadelphia's regional rail system that most lines on the system operate with a train every hour off-peak, with the worst cases being every 2 hours, particularly on weekends, and the rush hour is seeing service up to a train every 15 minutes. Now, I want you to remember that last frequency. A train every 15 minutes is the best case scenario. A train every 15 minutes was worse than the worst case scenario I had on the Copenhagen S-Tog. While some services would run as little as every 20 minutes, most stations on the network at worst see a service every 10 minutes, with many stations, particularly those served by 2 different train services, seeing a train every 5 minutes, and some seeing it every 2 minutes, particularly on the core section of the system through the city center. This is attained using several other things besides the benefits I mentioned earlier, including the trains having only one staff member on board most of the time, the driver, or engineer in the States, and this is a style of operation that the S-Tog has used since 1979. Plus, in recent years, there's the introduction of an advanced signaling system using communications-based train control, or CBTC. It would take a while to properly explain how it works, but the long and short of it is that it allows trains to run very close together in service much more reliably, and not subjecting trains to a lot of slowdowns waiting for trains to clear stations and switches. Some lines on the New York City subway use this system now, and frankly most modern metro systems use this technology. And a lot of older systems, the ones that actually invest in their systems, are retrofitting it into their signaling. But all things considered, this made the Copenhagen S-Tog stupidly easy to use. When I was staying in Denmark, I stayed with my friend Nick in a suburb near the far edge of the line to Køge in the southern edge of the suburbs. And my local station was, ironically named, considering where I'm from. So I just flew 7.5 hours across an ocean, and where do I end up? In Jersey. But even on this far edge of the suburbs, the worst frequency we ever got was a train every 10 minutes. It was so reliable and so frequent that whenever we walked to a station and saw a train on the platform that we knew we were never going to catch in time, this was the phrase that came out of our mouths each time.
Oh no! Anyway.
It was that reliable. You legitimately don't need to look at a schedule. You can just get on a train after a few minutes wait at worst. And that's where we get into the very unique ways that the Copenhagen S-Tog runs their stopping patterns. If you've ever watched RM Transit in the past, before Reese decided to turn his attention to his blog, you might recall a video he made where he talked about the unique scheduling system of the Copenhagen S-Tog. While a good amount of the network runs a more conventional pattern, with some only running local services, and the B service between Høje-Tastrup, the city, and Farum having a rush hour express variant called the BX, the really interesting one to me was on the line that I spent most of my time during this trip, and that was the Køge and Hillerød lines, served by the A and E services. These services are unique in that they always change their stopping patterns after they pass through the city, enabling both local and express services to be run consistently all day, at least when they do this pattern on weekdays. On weekends, both lines are only run by the A service. The temptation to say the A train a la the New York City subway is killing me right now. But on weekdays, it's much more interesting. Going from south to north in this case, the E train starts its run from Køge, making local stops until the train reaches Hundig, which is where the A train starts its run north. After the next station on the line, Isug, The E then runs express, skipping stops all the way to the major interchange station of Copenhagen South, and stopping at the stations in the city, all while gaining distance over the following A train, which is running a local service at this point, stopping all stations to the city. After the last of the stations that they serve within the city, the stopping pattern then reverses. That E train that gained such a lead over the A now becomes a local service, stopping at all the stations until the E train terminates at Hylte, and the A becomes an express, skipping most of the intermediate stops to Hylte, and then stopping at the remaining stations after that until the end of the line at Hillerød. And this same pattern holds in the other direction as well, with the A expressing south from Hillerød to the city and local to Hundig, and the E running local from Hylte to the city and express to Køge. It's a really interesting pattern that allows for passengers in the further suburbs to have faster service from the far suburbs of the city on consistent express trains throughout the day. And that's without causing too many headaches for passengers on trains stopping all stations either. And it's something that more cities maybe should consider as an idea to improve speeds and consistency on their services too. To my knowledge, this seems to be pretty much a Copenhagen exclusive idea as far as its use on suburban rail systems goes, and is not part and parcel of an S-Bahn. In fact, I don't think there's any of the German, Swiss, or Austrian systems that do anything similar to it. Though I have no doubt my 3 German viewers, one of whom is Jamie from Tales from the S-Bahn, will be furiously correcting me if I got that wrong. Sorry Jamie, please don't crucify me. But it all definitely goes to show just how different a lot of systems that are technically classified as the same kind of system can be, and how a good transit service needs to be built to serve the unique needs of the people who live there. And Copenhagen does this so well in no small part because the S-Tog was not just built to serve those needs, it was the primary consideration for Copenhagen's post-war suburban development. After the war, Copenhagen launched an urban development plan known as the Finger Plan, which made it so that all suburban developments of the city would spread out in 5 corridors from the city, with the overall shape of the developments looking like a hand, with Copenhagen as the palm. It was a fascinating concept, and it was largely successful in catering to Copenhagen's growth in the post-war years, while at the same time preserving most of the countryside for small villages and towns, and particularly the farms that needed that land to grow crops. It created suburbs without creating urban sprawl, something that urbanists dream of here in the States. And what was the thing that created these urban corridors? What were the primary arteries that these suburbs would be built around? It was the S-Tog lines. And today, nearly 80 years later, with the system built out, it's easily one of the most popular ways to commute. Yes, highways certainly exist in Denmark, and they're not immune to the traffic we see back in the US, speaking from experience. But the public transport system puts up a stiff fight against car alternatives using the powers of convenience, high-performance equipment, and good connections and planning to its advantage. And that's only set to improve in the coming years as Copenhagen is planning a major step for the S-Tog network: driverless operations. You heard me right. Enabled by the sealed-off nature of the network, Copenhagen will be debuting driverless trains on the S-Tog in the 2030s, starting on the ring line around the city that currently runs the F service before spreading around the network in the next decade, using trains from a manufacturer yet to be picked but will be later this year, but it will either be Alstom, CAF, or a consortium of Siemens and Stadler. It shows that the target of success is a constantly changing thing, and that very often, success begets success. This was something that in theory should have been the case across the ocean in Philadelphia, when they saw systems like this and the ones in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, and realized that a lot of good could be had with running a system that took the form of an S-Bahn. But the curious question remains, where did Philadelphia stumble where Copenhagen succeeded? Well, let's leave the Nordics behind, as much as I'm sure some don't want me to. Don't worry, I'll come back to you later. But let's take a look at SEPTA's attempts at creating an S-Bahn. If you recall my video where I talked about how SEPTA's regional rail system is set up, click on this if you haven't, you'll recall me saying that the system we know today was originally 2 separate systems built and run by 2 rival private companies, with 7 lines of the current system, though one's kind of an oddball case, running on tracks formerly a part of the Pennsylvania Railroad, later the Penn Central, while the 6 other lines of the system were formerly a part of the Reading Railroad, and both of these networks would be stub-ended and ended their own respective terminal stations in Center City, Philadelphia. With the bankruptcy of most major railroads in the northeastern US in the 1960s and 70s, a rather unique opportunity presented itself in the late 70s when both the Penn Central and the Reading would be merged by the federal government with several other bankrupt railroads into the government-backed Consolidated Rail Corporation, or Conrail. Now, the idea of a Center City tunnel was an old one, with the Pennsy considering the idea as far back as the 1920s at least. However, it wasn't until the late 50s that the concept was seriously looked at in city planning, largely as a way to revitalize the Center City area, which was experiencing a decline in population at the time due to suburbanization. And even then, because this would have required the coordination of 2 arch-rival private railroad companies, even organizations like the PSIC and its successor SEPTA would have been incapable of seriously bringing this idea forward without radical change. But eventually, radical change it would get when both the Penn Central and the Reading went bust and were joined together to create Conrail in 1976. With the entire network now under one operator, like with Copenhagen, this made the coordination of prospective operations much easier. The city had the idea kicking around in their urban planning folders for a while and was being steadily refined, and this would be topped off with federal support for the project to the tune of the Federal Transit Administration covering 80% of the cost, largely by the choice of the mayor at the time, Frank Rizzo, who did so by once again putting the Roosevelt Boulevard subway into the maybe later box for the billionth time in the process. Regardless, the Center City commuter connection would finally begin construction in 1978 and would be opened in 1984, 3 years late and just after Conrail stopped operating the commuter rail system, and the operations of the system were moved in-house to SEPTA, as it is today. Okay, so now they at least have one thing that an S-Bahn needed, a single unified operator, since that was never a problem almost anywhere else in the world for such a system. They now also had the critical central connecting piece of infrastructure to bring the network together in the form of the Center City Tunnel, so that heavy engineering lifting was done. And to celebrate this new operational format, the services would through run between both sides of the network, and all services would have a predictable format, where a train running on one line on one side of the network would always run to a certain line on the other side of the network. If your train was on the Paoli line, for instance, it would always run to the Doylestown line and vice versa. If your train was on the Media Elwyn line, it would always run to the West Trenton line and vice versa. And if your train was on the Warminster line, it would run to the Wilmington Newark line and vice versa. This was a genuinely good idea and was the brainchild of renowned transportation researcher Professor Vukan Vucic of the University of Pennsylvania. And by all accounts, this all should have been very achievable, and in one sense it was. And to top it all off, all the services had names that were almost directly taken from German S-Bahn practices, though instead of being S1, S2, S3, etc., or the alphabetical style used in Copenhagen, Philly's system would be R1, R2, R3 and the like, R meaning regional. In fact, that aspect was so enduring and so well liked that most people around Philadelphia still refer to those lines under the old R number system, even though it was officially dropped 15 years ago in 2010, ostensibly to improve operational flexibility. So they got the big infrastructure, the trains, for the most part, the single operator, and the naming convention. And the network was all electrified too. Perfect! So what else did Philly need for this to succeed? Well, pretty much everything else. But key among them was one particular thing: not pissing off their workers. The launch of the new regional services was also accompanied by SEPTA truly wanting to turn the network into a full-fledged rapid transit system, and that alongside rapid transit frequencies would also mean rapid transit-esque conditions for their workers, including replacing conductors with part-time passenger attendants, since while SEPTA probably wanted to do single crew operations, the FRA would have killed that idea immediately. Oh, and it also meant reducing engineer pay to the kind that subway operators got. Also, it meant firing a bunch of the conductors to help facilitate this. And this was only the start of the pure, unadulterated shenaniganry that SEPTA was pushing at this time under the leadership of a certain David L. Gunn, one of the more polarizing figures in the transit sphere. For everyone that loves his work at Amtrak and the New York MTA in the 90s and 2000s, there's someone else that hates him for his work elsewhere, particularly with SEPTA. However, this whole saga is quite a lot to go over, but thankfully some others did, so definitely check out the Well There's Your Problem podcast episode about the whole saga if you're interested. It's worth a watch. But the long and short of it was that this rapid push to convert the system to an S-Bahn-esque rapid transit operation resulted in a strike of SEPTA regional rail employees that lasted 108 days and cratered the ridership of the system to the point that it didn't return to pre-strike ridership levels until 2008. And this strike was in 1983, mind you. Good God, man. But even that aside, SEPTA stumbled on several fronts when trying to start an S-Bahn from the system they got, not least of which was the infrastructure projects they didn't do. And there is one that would have been really easy for them to implement, but they never did. This is North Philadelphia Station, and nearby is North Broad Station, two stations on SEPTA's network that are right next to each other but not connected by the same line. This is because it's here where the ex-Pennsylvania Railroad main line, better known today as the Northeast Corridor, crosses over the ex-Reading main line tracks, which is now SEPTA's primary corridor for the Reading side of the network into the city. Talking about this whole arrangement in detail would take all day, but the reason why I'm here is because of a plan that SEPTA had for when they were reconfiguring the network for another important project that was actually taking shape at the time. In the mid-80s, SEPTA was using former Reading Company freight spurs to connect to the Pennsylvania side of the network to the Philadelphia International Airport, creating the succinctly named Airport Line, which opened in 1985. However, this line presented a conundrum for the S-Bahn-esque operation of the network, and how train operations would be balanced from one side of the network to the other, generally not helped by the fact that the Reading side of the network had lower capacity to work with anyway, due to not being built to quite as high a standard as the Pennsylvania side of the network, which is still a problem today, by the way. But this was intended to be remedied with a very simple creation that would have possibly solved the problem. North Philadelphia Station is in fact a junction station, with the main line Northeast Corridor, which carries the Trenton line, running east-west across the city, but branching away to the north is the Chestnut Hill West line, which not only joins the NEC on a bottleneck-inducing junction, this one really sucks, but after North Philadelphia Station, this former Pennsy line runs directly parallel to a former Reading line, the Manayunk-Norristown line, before the two routes head off to their destinations. It would be along these two parallel lines that a connecting track would be built, where the Chestnut Hill West line would connect into the Manayunk-Norristown line instead of the Northeast Corridor, which would get rid of a bottleneck in the system and bring greater balance of the services on the network. This simple but innovative solution to a possible future problem would be named for the neighborhood where the connection would be built, becoming known as the Swampoodle Connection. Yes, I can hear you snickering back there. But you may have noticed something from the images here. Where is that connection? Well, that's the neat thing. It doesn't exist. It was never built, even if it would be stupidly easy to build compared to the stuff that was being done at the time. By this time, SEPTA was still struggling to recover ridership following the 1983 strike, and the residents of the neighborhood opposed it, as naturally happens with a sizable project like this. But the final nail in the coffin came with the Railworks project in the early 1990s, which was priority number one in order to prevent the network from collapsing. Quite literally, by the way. After Railworks, the project was never seriously taken up again, and there is quite a bit of debate on whether it was actually necessary in the first place, and even if it would be needed, if the proposed idea was even the right one to go with. But for the time being, we won't know, And given SEPTA's current budget uncertainties, this question will continue to go unanswered until something radical happens again. But aside from the big projects where new track is laid, there's a lot more shortcomings that once again have to do with the things that SEPTA did not do to make the system more like an S-Bahn, such as fixing every station on the network to have high-level platforms, improving the signaling of the network to accommodate future high frequencies, trains that were in any way suited to a more S-Bahn-esque network, and therefore becoming more of a commuter rail rapid transit hybrid style of operation rather than the strictly commuter operation you tend to see now. And perhaps as important as any other, a sealed off network from the rest of the national network. You recall how I said earlier that SEPTA is the unified operator of the network after all that happened to bring these two separate networks into one? Well, that's the thing. SEPTA may be the unified operator of the service, but they are not the unified operator of the infrastructure of the system. While SEPTA does own the majority of the trackage, there is a significant minority that's owned by another operator, Amtrak, America's national passenger rail operator, which has direct ownership of the tracks that make up the entirety of the Wilmington-Newark line from Center City to Newark, Delaware, the Trenton line from Center City to Trenton, New Jersey, both of which are part of the wider Northeast corridor between Washington and Boston. On top of that, Amtrak also owns the entirety of the trackage that SEPTA uses as the Paoli-Thorndale line, their most heavily used line from Center City to Thorndale, which is part of the Keystone Corridor from Philly to Harrisburg. And this is alongside the fact that a few other lines of the system, namely the Kinwood and Chestnut Hill West lines, can only be accessed from those Amtrak-owned lines, even if the tracks of the branches themselves are owned by SEPTA. Putting aside for one moment the complicated and sometimes contentious issue that results from this weird relationship, something that I'm working on a video about, don't worry, but this makes completely separating SEPTA's infrastructure from those used by Amtrak and their intercity trains borderline impossible, unless you somehow want to build a hideously expensive duplication of all the infrastructure of the lines just for SEPTA, which no sane person is even remotely considering right now. Oh, and this also is alongside certain parts of routes like the West Trenton, Manioc-Norristown, and Lansdale-Doylestown lines where SEPTA trains have to share rights of way with freight trains on occasion. Obviously, with SEPTA having control over their lines, they have a degree of control, but not complete control over it, and the organizations make for weird arrangements, shall I say. All this is to say that one of the key things that makes an S-Bahn a hybrid of commuter rail and rapid transits doesn't really exist for SEPTA, and likely won't be the case for the foreseeable future, even in a best-case high-investment scenario. And this in turn leads to a big question. Was an S-Bahn system even the right model to take inspiration from? Or were SEPTA serious about wanting to run the network in this way in the first place? Well, to answer the latter, I think SEPTA were serious about it, but more so as a cudgel to get their way in union negotiations, as well as to mark the construction of the Center City Tunnel in style. And while they built the big infrastructure piece and implemented the naming system with S-Bahn trappings, they didn't really grasp what else was needed at the time, and what projects they did want to do were put on indefinite hold as the rest of the system decayed around them, and were eventually cancelled altogether when the Railworks project took top priority. And this was only exacerbated by the fact that compared to other S-Bahn systems, this was to be a fast conversion of the network to this style. The Center City Tunnel began construction in 1978, and SEPTA basically tried to implement this style of operation between 1983 and 1986 or so, and they essentially abandoned any further serious pushes for this after 1991. That may be a grand total of 13 years, but that's pretty fast as these things go. Looking back at Copenhagen again, they converted their commuter lines to lines of the S-Tog network slowly. Sure, a World War slowed things down a little bit, but even still, the first line was converted in 1934, and the last one was converted in 1989. It's almost as if nobody involved in this whole thing, not SEPTA, not the city, not the counties, and certainly not the states, had any sort of long-term vision for what the agency and the system was supposed to become or something. Could almost make someone think that SEPTA's entire existence has been plagued with infighting between a ton of different local, regional, and state interests, not helped by a top decision-making body composed for the most part of people who have barely ever used it, and political masters who use it even less to the point of outright disrespect, and therefore have minimal understanding of how public transit even works and how it can be improved, thus leading to screw up on screw up for years in a system that's generally been stuck in the 1980s for 30 years. In fact, after the Railworks project came to a close in the early 1990s, in 1994, Vukan Vucic, that same Professor Vukan Vucic that is said to be the one that pioneered SEPTA's S-Bahn ambitions, led a study into how SEPTA has done since the opening of the Center City Tunnel a decade prior. While he did give praise to the improvement of the overall system reliability since its opening, and some of the smaller scale infrastructural upgrades that came in the following years, as well as the building of the airport line, there were a lot of criticisms as well, which I want to talk about another time, but the main one I want to focus on was that on a broad level, while the network had the external trappings of an S-Bahn, at its core, it was still run predominantly as an old-fashioned commuter rail operation, focused on peak hour services rather than being consistent and reliable all day. And that the agency was crippled by an outdated organizational structure and outdated, perhaps even regressive practices that hurt both the system's financial performance and its appeal to people in the region. But alongside all these criticisms, Vucic listed off several short-term improvements that SEPTA could make and would go a long way to getting the public on side with them, and a cornerstone to rebuild that trust, including improved cleaning at major stations, particularly 30th Street, which was pretty bad at the time, better advertising of their major connections, all the way to just putting ticket vending machines in at all stations. Yeah, that's an issue. And did they do it? Well, 30th Street does look a lot nicer now, so I'd probably say yes on that one, but that's about it. Their advertising used to be somewhat okay, though it fell off a cliff in recent years in my estimation, something that will be its own video. And as for ticket vending machines at all stations...
Oh wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
It's little surprise to me that with most of these recommendations being unheeded or paying lip service to, that SEPTA succumbed to what Vucic predicted, a continued downward spiral that eventually has led to the recent budget crisis that SEPTA is going through, where potentially half of all service could be axed if state funding is not forthcoming. Don't get me wrong, SEPTA needs and deserves that money, since not funding them would ruin the lives of many thousands of people in the Philadelphia region, and all of us around here need to stand firm for SEPTA. But I definitely understand a lot of the criticisms that get levied at them, and serious appraisals and even outright reform of upper leadership, particularly of the agency's board of directors, need to happen to truly right the ship and start to put Philadelphia's transit on a path where it can be legitimately praised and its sky-high potential be reached. And even then, I do wonder if an S-Bahn is even the proper thing to take inspiration from. While I do think the naming convention and the marketing aspect of the system would do well to present itself as an S-Bahn, from an operational standpoint, there's another kind of suburban rail service that could be good to take a lot of advice from, especially for running a high-frequency system on lines that have to be shared by intercity passenger and freight trains. And that's the kind of systems that they have in Australia, particularly referring to cities like Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane, where they've been able to run trains every 15 to 20 minutes consistently on each line, while also having lines shared with a lot of freight traffic, because Australia has a ton of that. But that's something that will be its own video when I go into detail about what SEPTA ought to strive for their system. This video is long enough already, I'm sure you'd agree. Copenhagen was indeed a very memorable experience for me for many reasons, but especially so as a transit advocate and rail fan from Philadelphia, it does put a lot of things in perspective. It really puts a lot of what is truly needed to build a great transit system front and center, and it goes much further than infrastructure and trains. It goes down into how it's organized, and while Copenhagen does have its major complexities, something I'll elaborate on in the future, The end result, from the S-Tog to the metro, the buses, and the new light rail system they're building, is a system that's a first choice for many more people, largely because of how easy it is to get good use out of it. It's fast, efficient, comfortable, frequent, and gets you to lots of places that people want to go for work and leisure. And in the words of my good Danish friend and tour guide Nick, it just works.
Also, say hi, Nick.
Hi.
For reference, he and his family, who I was very privileged to meet while I was there, have two of the biggest car aficionados I've probably met in my life. And hell, they run a little kart racing team. That's how seriously they take that sort of thing. And this is also coming from someone who likes cars a lot and racing. But they also love trains too, especially Nick's dad. And if they have to go somewhere in the metro area, they take the S-Tog and the buses. It is a true, viable alternative to driving in a lot of cases. It takes a lot to get to the point where it just works for the vast majority like Copenhagen is, but alongside good infrastructure and good trains, it also requires an actual comprehensive plan, a long-term vision, and sticking to said vision. Copenhagen had all of that in spades, whereas Philadelphia's ambitions were more a case of a big infrastructure project with a vestigial operation plan added on in the process. That's not to say this can't happen, however, back in Philly, and that vision could come from anywhere, citizens, agencies, or government. But it actually needs to be a true, comprehensive plan that looks to the future that the agency, the city, the counties, and the state wants to see for SEPTA. And that could even include many other transit agencies as well. And fear not, all this will be the topic of one of my overarching mega projects for this channel, alongside a few others. The recent funding crisis that SEPTA has been going through has indeed made me curious as to what can be done to win the political argument to properly break this spiral and give Philadelphia a system like Copenhagen's. Because as much as the technical side of things may not entirely be similar to an S-Bahn, Philly still has the bones of a world-class transit system, one that even Pennsylvanians outside the Philly metro area can be proud of, and one that can start the true renaissance of public transit services across the Keystone State, even sparking major positive reform in the process. And naturally, it's good to look at foreign examples of success to get a sense of what works and what doesn't. Though, naturally, you can't just copy and paste an S-Bahn system into a city like you're copying and pasting text from a document, which seems at a casual glance like what Philly tried to do. At the very least, their attempt to do that gave us infrastructure that can serve near S-Bahn-like frequencies if it were given the chance. But we need to give it that mythical chance. Copenhagen certainly did, and they're reaping the benefits of it every day. Less congestion on roads, healthier developments along the lines, both literally and financially, and a city that's easy to get around by many means. It's also easy to look at what Copenhagen has and decide that such a thing is impossible for a city in the US, be it technically or politically. But at some point, I'm sure someone has said the same thing about Copenhagen. And boy was that person proved very, very wrong, as Copenhagen can serve as a goal to strive towards in the years and decades to come for the long-term future of how we get around.